It was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the small town of Willow Creek. Marcus, a 17-year-old high school student, had been looking forward to getting home and finishing his homework before heading to the basketball court to meet up with his friends. His life had always been predictable, structured, and calm. He was a responsible young man, raised in a home where hard work and respect were values passed down by his late father, a man who had worked multiple jobs to provide for his family. His mother, a quiet but strong woman, had always encouraged him to do what was right, even when it was hard, because doing the right thing was what truly mattered in the end. As Marcus walked down Maple Street, headphones on, immersed in the latest rap track, he noticed something unusual lying on the sidewalk near the corner of the street. It was a wallet. Not just any wallet, but a thick leather one that looked expensive. Curious, he took off his headphones and slowly bent down to pick it up. The weight of the wallet in his hand felt off, too heavy to be just a simple wallet. It felt like there was something more inside. His mind immediately went into overdrive. It could be filled with cash. Maybe a lot of it. Marcus had been doing his best to help his mother with bills. But times had been tough. His father's death had left them with fewer resources, and though his mother worked hard as a nurse at the local clinic, the bills seemed to keep piling up. His thoughts raced. Should he keep it? A quick glance up and down the street showed no one around, no one to ask, no one to notice. He could easily pocket the money and pretend it never happened. Just like that, his problems would seem a little lighter. But then he remembered the values his parents had instilled in him. Do the right thing, Marcus, even when it's hard. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Marcus had always been taught that doing the right thing was the only way to live, even if no one was watching. He couldn't shake the feeling that his father, if he were still around, would have been disappointed in him for even considering keeping something that didn't belong to him. The wallet was full of cash. He could feel the thick stack of bills pressing against his hand as he flipped it open. There was also an ID card, and a few other cards, credit cards, insurance cards. But the real surprise was the elderly man's ID, Mr. Jenkins. Marcus had seen him around town before, but only in passing. Mr. Jenkins was an old man who lived just a few blocks away. He was known to everyone in the neighborhood, a quiet war veteran with no family left to speak of. His house, while well kept, was solitary, surrounded by an overgrown garden that always seemed to need a little extra attention. Marcus had seen him sitting on his porch some mornings, waving at the passing cars, but that was the extent of their interaction. Still, he was part of the fabric of the town, just as much as the local bakery or the small-town library. Marcus knew what he had to do. There was no way he could keep this wallet. It wasn't his money to take. Even if no one would ever know, even if Mr. Jenkins might never realize it was gone, Marcus would know. He had been raised better than that. He could feel his heart racing as he thought about the possibility of returning the wallet. What if Mr. Jenkins was upset? What if he thought Marcus was trying to steal it? The thoughts began to swirl. Maybe there was a reason the wallet was left out here in the open. Maybe Mr. Jenkins had misplaced it or dropped it on purpose. But Marcus couldn't make assumptions. He couldn't justify keeping the money, no matter the reason. As he made his way to Mr. Jenkins's house, his mind played over all the possible outcomes. What if Mr. Jenkins wasn't home? What if he was angry or confused when he found out that his wallet had been returned? What if Marcus was wrong in assuming the wallet was even Mr. Jenkins to begin with? The nerves began to crawl up Marcus's spine, but he pushed them down. Doing the right thing wasn't supposed to be easy, he reminded himself. He walked a little faster, his footsteps echoing down the quiet street, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. The town was peaceful, and it was moments like these that made him realize how much he appreciated the simplicity of it all. When Marcus reached Mr. Jenkins's house, he hesitated for a moment, standing at the front gate. The small yard was overgrown, and the house itself looked like it hadn't been painted in years. The faint smell of old wood and earth lingered in the air. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. Marcus rang the doorbell and waited. The seconds felt like hours. Then, through the screen door, he saw the old man shuffle toward him. His gray hair was unkempt, and his clothes were worn, but he still stood tall. His face lit up with recognition as he opened the door. "Ah, Marcus, what can I do for you, son?" Mr. Jenkins's voice was warm. Despite his age, his eyes kind. Marcus felt his nerves fade a little as he held up the wallet. The old man's eyes widened as he reached for it, his hand shaking slightly. "Mr. Jenkins," Marcus began, "I found this wallet on the sidewalk over by Maple Street. I thought it might be yours." Mr. Jenkins took the wallet in his hand, his expression softening. "Well, I'll be. That's my wallet all right." "Thank you, Marcus. You're a good boy." His hands fumbled with the wallet for a moment as he inspected it. "I wasn't sure where it had gone. Must have dropped it somewhere when I was out walking this morning. I appreciate you bringing it back to me." Marcus smiled, feeling a little lighter. He was doing the right thing, and it felt good. The elderly man's gratitude was enough to lift his spirits. "Well, I'm glad I could help," Marcus said. "I know how hard it is to keep track of things sometimes." Mr. Jenkins laughed, his voice cracking slightly. "Ain't that the truth? Getting old comes with a lot of little forgetful moments. You're sure this is all of it? Nothing's missing?" Marcus nodded, feeling confident in his decision. "Yes, sir. Everything's there." Mr. Jenkins paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to the ground. Then he looked back up at Marcus with a twinkle in his eye. "Well, I don't have much to offer, son, but I'd like to give you something as a thank you. I'm sure it's not much, but it's the thought that counts." Marcus shook his head quickly, refusing the offer. "No, sir, I can't take anything for just doing the right thing." Mr. Jenkins smiled warmly. "Well, that's a rare thing these days, isn't it? You're a good kid, Marcus. Your parents should be proud of you." As Marcus turned to leave, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done the right thing, but more than that, he had done something that mattered. He had made a small difference in some. Before Marcus could process what was happening, the man stepped inside without waiting for an answer. The woman stayed just outside, scanning the street as if making sure no one was watching. Marcus stood frozen in place, confused and a little afraid. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had returned the wallet to Mr. Jenkins like any good person would. But why were the police involved now? The officers didn't wait for him to invite them in further. They walked into the living room where his mother had been speaking on the phone. The man went straight to her, introducing himself as Officer Stevens and gesturing for her to hang up. Marcus's mother looked up, her face drained of color, and she quickly ended the call, her eyes wide with concern. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice shaky. Officer Stevens looked at Marcus for a moment before turning back to her. "We're investigating an incident involving Mr. Jenkins, and your son may be involved." "Investigating?" His mother's voice cracked. "What do you mean? Marcus hasn't done anything wrong. He just found the wallet and returned it." The younger officer, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "It's not about the return of the wallet itself. It's about what happened afterward." Marcus felt his heart drop into his stomach. He didn't understand. What could possibly be wrong with returning a lost wallet? He turned to his mother, looking for some sort of comfort, but all he saw was worry in her eyes. "What do you mean, what happened afterward?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling slightly. The officer glanced at him. "We have reason to believe that the wallet you returned wasn't Mr. Jenkins's, not in the way you think." Marcus's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" The officer took a step forward, flipping open his notepad. "Marcus, we've discovered that Mr. Jenkins's wallet had been swapped out with a decoy. The real wallet, with all the identification and cash, was stolen from him earlier that day by someone who knew him. Whoever took it replaced it with a near-identical wallet, hoping to implicate someone who would find it." Marcus's mind raced. His hands suddenly felt clammy, and he could feel his pulse quicken. But But I returned it. I didn't take anything. I didn't know anything was wrong. Officer Stevens nodded slowly. We believe the person who stole the wallet had been planning to involve someone unsuspecting, like yourself, in the crime. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, Marcus, and that's why we're here. To ask you some questions. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Marcus tried to collect his thoughts, but his mind was a blur of confusion. Why would someone set him up like this? He had simply done what he thought was right. Now the police were standing in his living room, questioning his every move. Was this some kind of mistake? Was he being framed? We just need to know everything that happened when you found the wallet, the younger officer said, taking a few steps toward Marcus. She had a softer tone than her partner, but the seriousness of the situation still hung over her words. What did you do when you found it? Did you notice anything strange about it? Any other details might help us understand what happened. Marcus's mind was reeling, but he recounted the events of the day before as best he could. I was just walking home from school when I found the wallet. I didn't think anything was wrong at first. I saw the ID, and I figured it belonged to Mr. Jenkins, so I went straight to his house to return it. I didn't think about it any further. The officers exchanged another look. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, Officer Stevens spoke again. Did you open the wallet? Check the contents? Marcus nodded. Yeah, I opened it to check if it had any money or cards inside. There was cash, a few credit cards, some ID, and, well, nothing seemed out of place. I didn't think anything was odd about it. The woman officer stepped closer, lowering her voice. And did you notice anything unusual about the ID? The name or anything that didn't look right? No, Marcus said quickly. It just seemed like a normal wallet. Mr. Jenkins's ID, his credit cards, everything looked fine. Officer Stevens let out a long breath and looked at his partner. All right, Marcus, I think that's all for now. We'll need to verify a few things, but we'll be in touch. Please don't leave town. Before Marcus could respond, the officers turned and walked toward the door. His mother, still standing behind him, looked as if she had just aged years in the span of a few minutes. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Marcus alone in the heavy silence of his home. The weight of the situation settled in. He had no idea what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. Nothing was going to be the same after today. The evening dragged on in a haze for Marcus. His thoughts swirled in a frantic whirlpool, and he couldn't escape the sensation that something was terribly wrong. The police had left with more questions than answers, and now, sitting in his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to spiral out of control. The knock on the door had shattered the peaceful routine of his home, and the words from the officers echoed in his mind, refusing to let go. We believe the person who stole the wallet had been planning to involve someone unsuspecting, like yourself. Marcus tried to make sense of it. How had he gone from simply helping someone to becoming the center of an investigation? Everything he had done was motivated by kindness. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't even considered that something might be wrong with the wallet until the police arrived. He tried to talk to his mom, but she seemed as lost as he was. She had barely spoken since the officers left, sitting at the kitchen table, wringing her hands nervously. Every time Marcus glanced over at her, she looked more and more drained, her face pale and pinched with worry. She wasn't just worried about the investigation, though. She was worried about him. He could see it in the way her eyes followed him when he moved through the house, the concern that deepened with every passing hour. You don't have to worry, Mom. I didn't do anything wrong, Marcus said softly, though the words didn't sound convincing even to him. He tried to reassure her, but he could see the doubt flicker in her eyes. I know you didn't, Marcus, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But these things don't always make sense. People don't always see things the way they really are. He sat down at the table across from her, staring at the half-empty coffee cup in front of her. His mom had always been the pillar of strength in their family, never the one to get rattled, Yet now she was barely holding it together. "I don't understand, Mom. Why would someone try to get me involved in something like this? Why would they leave a wallet that wasn't even Mr. Jenkins?" His voice trembled as he spoke, the frustration seeping through his words. "I just did the right thing." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she folded a napkin in her lap. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't always go the way we expect. But I raised you better than this, Marcus. I know you, and I know you would never do something like that. The question is, how do we prove that?" Before Marcus could respond, there was another knock at the door. His heart dropped. He had been dreading this moment all afternoon, and now it was here. With a sinking feeling, he stood up and moved toward the door, his footsteps heavy. This time, it wasn't the police officers. Standing on the doorstep was none other than Mr. Jenkins. His face was haggard, his clothes as worn as ever. His hand shook slightly as he held the doorframe, his eyes filled with something that could only be described as regret. "Mr. Jenkins," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what are you doing here?" The elderly man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. I didn't know who else to talk to, Marcus." His voice quivered with emotion. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never thought that I could have caused something like this." Marcus was stunned. What was he talking about? "Mr. Jenkins, I don't understand. You didn't do anything wrong. I just returned the wallet." I know, Marcus," Mr. Jenkins interrupted, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were looking for something or someone. "But I didn't know what was really going on. That wallet wasn't mine. The one you found. The one I thought was mine. It had been switched out." Marcus felt his stomach lurch. "Switched out? What are you talking about?" Mr. Jenkins's face contorted with shame, his hands wringing together in a desperate attempt to gather his thoughts. "I didn't know about the swap until later. I was at the local market when I was approached by someone. He seemed harmless, just a man trying to get by, asking for change. I didn't think much of it when he offered to buy me a coffee, and we sat and talked for a bit. When I got up to leave, my wallet was gone." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "So you didn't lose it on the sidewalk? Someone took it from you?" The old man nodded slowly, his face full of guilt. "Yes, and I didn't realize until after you returned it that the wallet had been switched. The man who took mine replaced it with a near-identical one, hoping someone would pick it up and return it to me. That someone being you." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "He knew I was old. He knew I'd be easy to manipulate. But you, Marcus, you were the one he targeted without even knowing it." Marcus stood frozen, his thoughts racing. It felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, like he was caught in some elaborate scheme he couldn't possibly comprehend. He had thought he was just helping out, doing the right thing. But now he was caught up in something much bigger. "I'm sorry," Mr. Jenkins continued, his eyes full of regret. "I should have known better. I should have been more careful. I never meant to drag you into this." Wait, hold on," Marcus said, trying to process everything. "So, you're telling me that someone set me up? That I wasn't just returning your wallet, but a decoy?" "Yes. They thought they could make you look like the thief. They thought you would take the bait." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. His thoughts were a blur. Everything had changed in an instant. He hadn't been trying to do anything wrong. He hadn't stolen anything. And yet here he was, wrapped up in a lie that wasn't even his. "So, what now? What happens to me?" Mr. Jenkins looked down, his voice barely audible. "I don't know, Marcus, but I'll tell you this much. There's something bigger going on. I've heard rumors around town. People say there's a network of people doing this kind of thing, stealing from the elderly, setting up innocent people to take the fall. You might have been caught in something bigger than either of us realized." The words hit Marcus like a slap. He had been drawn into something far darker than a simple act of kindness. And now, there were even more questions hanging in the air, unanswered and unresolved. As the weight of it all settled over him, Marcus could feel the eyes of the entire town on him. He wasn't just a teenager trying to do the right thing anymore. He was now a part of something larger, a mystery that could change everything. As Mr. Jenkins turned to leave, Marcus was left standing in the doorway, watching him disappear into the fading light. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his mind reeling. The quiet house felt suffocating, the walls closing in on him. The one thing that had been simple and pure, a good deed, was now tangled in a mess of deceit, betrayal, and something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And that was just the beginning. The days after Mr. Jenkins's visit felt like they were moving in slow motion. Marcus couldn't escape the feeling that he was living in some kind of nightmare, one that had begun with a simple act of kindness and spiraled into a nightmare that was beyond his control. Every time he walked through the halls at school, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Whispers followed him wherever he went. The police had been back to speak with his mother, asking more questions, investigating every detail of the situation. They told her that Marcus was not a suspect, but it didn't make him feel any better. The officers were still looking into the theft of the wallet, and Marcus was trapped in the middle, caught between doing the right thing and dealing with the consequences of what others had done. But it wasn't just the police that had Marcus on edge. It was the feeling that he couldn't trust anyone anymore. He couldn't look at Mr. Jenkins the same way, and he certainly couldn't look at the people around him without wondering if they had an agenda. He had thought he lived in a safe, quiet town where things like this didn't happen, where you could trust your neighbors, your friends, and your family. But now, the streets felt different. He had been pulled into something far darker than he could have imagined, and there was no escaping it. It was a Saturday when everything finally came to a head. Marcus had spent the morning holed up in his room, trying to concentrate on his schoolwork, but it was no use. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the past week. He kept picturing the moment the police had come to his door, the look on his mother's face when they told her they were investigating him, and the sinking feeling he had felt when he learned about the wallet switch. He wanted to forget it all. He wanted to go back to being a normal teenager, worrying about grades and basketball games and hanging out with his friends. But that was no longer an option. His phone buzzed on his desk, interrupting his thoughts. He picked it up, expecting a text from one of his friends, but the message was from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before opening it, but the curiosity got the better of him. The message was short and to the point. "Meet me at the old library in 30 minutes. I know what really happened. A friend." Marcus's heart raced as he read the message again, trying to make sense of it. Who was this person? And why were they sending him a message like this? Was it another trap? A part of him wanted to ignore it, to stay home and keep his head down, but something inside him wouldn't let him. He needed answers. He needed to know what was really going on, what had happened to the wallet, and why his life had been turned upside down. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, the weight of the message pressing down on him with every step. The old library was just a few blocks away, a crumbling building that had been closed for years. No one ever went there anymore, except for a few kids who dared each other to go inside at night. The place had always given him an eerie feeling, but now it seemed like the perfect spot for someone to meet him in secret. He arrived at the library in record time, his heart pounding in his chest. The street was empty, the usual hustle and bustle of the town absent. The silence seemed unnatural, as if the world around him was holding its breath. He pushed open the rusted door of the library and stepped inside. The air was musty, and the dim light filtering through the cracked windows did little to illuminate the rows of abandoned shelves. The building smelled of old books and dust, a place frozen in time. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for someone to reveal themselves. But there was no one in sight. "Hello," Marcus called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no answer, but then, just as he was about to turn around and leave, he heard a creak from above. He looked up and saw a figure standing on the second-floor balcony, half hidden in the darkness. "You came," the figure said, their voice low and gravelly. "I wasn't sure you would." Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the voice. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "What do you know about the wallet? What do you know about what's happening?" The figure stepped into the light, and Marcus was shocked to see a familiar face, one he never expected. It was Chris, one of the older kids from his school, someone he had always known from a distance. Chris had a reputation around town, a bit of a loner, always hanging out with the wrong crowd. Marcus had never really spoken to him, but he knew enough to stay clear of him. "I'm the one who switched the wallets," Chris said, a dark smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "And I'm the one who set you up." Marcus's blood ran cold. "You? What? Why? Why did you do that?" Chris shrugged, as if it was no big deal. "It was all part of the plan, man. You didn't know it, but you were just the pawn. It wasn't about you. It was about the old man and the game we're playing." Marcus stepped back, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The game. What game? "You're telling me that all this, the cops, the investigation, everything, was part of some game?" Chris chuckled darkly. "You think the police are the ones running this town? Nah, man, they don't even know what's really going on. This is bigger than they could ever imagine. The people behind this, they control everything. The wallets, the scams, the whole operation. They knew exactly who would pick up that wallet and return it. You were just a piece in their little puzzle." Marcus's head spun. It was like someone had just pulled back the curtain, revealing a world he never knew existed. All of his suspicions about the situation, the weirdness of it all, were beginning to make sense. He wasn't just a random person who had found a wallet. He had been carefully chosen, a pawn in a scheme far bigger than he could have ever understood. "But why me?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would they want me involved?" Chris leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and menace. "Because you were the perfect mark. You were the kid who everyone trusted, the one who would do the right thing. And that's exactly what they needed. They needed someone to play the part of Marcus stood frozen in the dimly lit library, his heart pounding against his chest as Chris's words reverberated in his mind. "The game has started, and you're in it whether you like it or not." The coldness in Chris's voice made his skin crawl. This wasn't a game. This was something much more sinister, and now Marcus was trapped in the middle of it. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. How had it all escalated so quickly? He had thought he was simply helping an elderly man, doing the right thing by returning a lost wallet. But now he understood that he had been a mere pawn in a much larger scheme. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was calculated, carefully orchestrated, and Marcus had been selected for a reason, though he didn't yet fully understand why. "You said they were watching me," Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with growing concern. "Who are they? Who's behind this?" Chris's gaze flickered, but his expression remained unreadable. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the room as if he were worried someone might overhear. Finally, he leaned in closer, his breath barely a whisper. "You're in way deeper than you realize, Marcus," Chris said. "There's a network, people pulling strings, controlling things from the shadows. They run everything. Businesses, the cops, even the way people think. They've been using people like you for years, playing this game without anyone realizing it. It's all about manipulation, about getting the right people in the right places." Marcus felt a wave of nausea hit him as the weight of Chris's words sank in. The town he had grown up in, the community he had thought he understood, everything he knew was a lie. The thought that someone, some group, was controlling the lives of ordinary people, like puppeteers pulling invisible strings, made him feel sick. And yet here he was, caught in their web, unable to escape. "But why me?" Marcus repeated, his voice growing louder, desperation creeping in. Why did they choose me for this? Chris's lips curled into a tight, knowing smile. Because you were the perfect candidate. You're the good kid, the one everyone trusts. They knew you'd return the wallet without a second thought. They knew you'd do the right thing. And that's exactly what they needed. An innocent person to set up. Someone who would lead the police to the next stage of the game. Marcus's mind was racing. The next stage. What stage? Was this all part of a larger plan? He had no idea what Chris was talking about, but the sense of dread in his gut told him that this was far from over. He had unknowingly walked into something much bigger than he ever could have imagined. What's next, then? Marcus asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. What do I do now? How do I get out of this? Chris shrugged, his face devoid of emotion. There's no getting out now, Marcus. You're in too deep. If you try to go to the police, if you try to expose them, they'll destroy everything you've ever known. They'll turn your life upside down and make sure you're the one everyone believes is guilty. They've got enough power to make that happen. They've been doing it for years. Marcus felt the air around him become thick, suffocating. His legs felt weak beneath him as the weight of Chris's words settled heavily on his shoulders. There was no way out. He had already made the wrong move by trusting that returning the wallet would be the right thing. And now he was stuck. He had no allies, no way to fight back. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. So, what do you want from me? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes locked onto Chris. What do you want me to do? Chris's eyes flickered with something that could almost be described as amusement. You don't get it, do you? He said with a laugh that was more sinister than anything Marcus had heard before. They've already chosen for you. They've decided where you fit in this game. All you can do now is play your part, or they'll make sure you regret it. You don't have any say in this anymore. You're just another piece on the board. Marcus swallowed hard. His pulse raced in his ears, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. He had always prided himself on doing the right thing, on being someone people could count on. But now, everything he had believed in, everything that had shaped him, was crashing down around him. He had no idea who to trust, who was playing him, and who might be in on this twisted game. Chris took a step back, his posture relaxing, as if he were satisfied with the look of defeat in Marcus's eyes. But don't worry, Marcus, he said, a dark gleam in his eye. You're not alone. There are others who've been brought into this, just like you. You just haven't met them yet. And when you do, you'll understand what I'm talking about. You'll see the bigger picture. It's only a matter of time. Marcus's head spun as Chris turned and began to walk toward the library's exit. You don't have to trust me, Chris called over his shoulder. But you better start thinking about what you're going to do next, because the next move is yours, whether you want it to be or not. With those final words, Chris disappeared into the shadows, leaving Marcus standing alone in the abandoned library. The air felt cold now, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around him. He was trapped, caught between two worlds, the one he had known, and the one he had just been forced into. There was no going back. Everything had changed in an instant. And now, all he could do was figure out how to survive in a world that was no longer the one he thought he understood. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt truly alone. But as he stood there, trying to gather his thoughts, a new sense of determination began to build inside him. He didn't know how to fight back yet. He didn't know who to trust. But one thing was certain, he couldn't just let this happen to him. He had to find a way to take control of his own fate, even if it meant going up against something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The game was on, and Marcus had no choice but to play. But he was going to play by his own rules, and he was going to make sure he won. The hero, someone to return the wallet, and lead the police right to where they wanted them. Marcus took a step back, feeling sick to his stomach. "And what now? What do you want from me?" Chris's smile faded, and his expression turned cold. Now you're in too deep. There's no going back. The people behind this, they're watching you. And if you don't play along, if you try to go to the police or expose them, they'll make sure you regret it." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Marcus felt the weight of them settle over him. He had thought returning the wallet was the right thing to do. But now, standing in the middle of the abandoned library with Chris watching him, he realized that he had unknowingly stepped into something far darker, far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. And now, there was no way out. The game had started, and he was in it whether he liked it or not. The days that followed Chris's cryptic warning felt like an unending spiral of confusion and dread. Marcus couldn't shake the weight of the world pressing down on him. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the eyes of the town on him, watching, judging. Every glance, every whisper, every conversation seemed to carry a weight he couldn't escape. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. His life had been turned upside down, and the more he learned, the less he seemed to understand. The network that Chris had hinted at, this shadowy group that seemed to control everything, pulling strings from the dark corners of the world, wasn't some far-off conspiracy. It was real. And it was happening right here, in the town he thought he knew. For the first time, Marcus began to doubt the world he'd grown up in. How much of what he had seen and experienced was controlled by people behind the scenes? How much of his life had been influenced by this unseen hand? It was a terrifying thought, one that gnawed at him day and night. He could no longer trust the familiar faces around him. His friends, his teachers, even his own neighbors, all of them seemed like potential actors in a play he didn't know he had been cast in. But as much as he hated the feeling of being manipulated, he couldn't ignore the fact that he had a choice to make. Chris had been clear. Marcus was already in too deep. There was no going back. But that didn't mean he had to roll over and let this group control him. If anything, it meant that he had to take action, figure out what the hell was going on, and find a way to regain control over his life. He spent days holed up in his room, researching anything he could find about this mysterious network. He combed through online forums, dug into old news articles, and asked questions to people he trusted. But every lead seemed to fizzle out. No one knew anything for sure, or at least no one was willing to admit it. There were rumors of corruption, of shady dealings, but nothing concrete, nothing that could give him the answers he needed. The only person who seemed to know anything was Mr. Jenkins, and even he was too scared to say much. Marcus had tried reaching out to him several times, but the old man had become even more withdrawn. Marcus could tell that Mr. Jenkins knew more than he was letting on, but there was a fear in his eyes whenever Marcus mentioned the network, the game. It was as if he had seen too much and was afraid to speak, afraid of the consequences of getting too involved. But one afternoon, as Marcus sat in the quiet of his room, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name. It was a message from Mr. Jenkins. "We need to talk. Meet me at the park at dusk." Marcus felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Finally, after all the days of uncertainty, Mr. Jenkins was reaching out. But why now? What had changed? And what more could the old man possibly know? Marcus grabbed his jacket and left his house without a second thought, the weight of his growing questions heavy on his shoulders. As he walked to the park, the streets seemed quieter than usual, the air thick with the tension that had followed him for days. The trees in the park swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long shadows across the grass. As the sun began to set, Marcus spotted Mr. Jenkins sitting on a bench near the far end of the park, his old frame hunched forward, eyes scanning the ground.